Hello, everybody. Welcome back for part 5 in our series on Dismantled. I didn't even look up the full name of the documentary for this one. It's the Dismantled something evolution documentary with AIG people and other creationists. It's the same thing we've been. It's the same thing we've been doing. This is part 5. So I am joined with my guests. Above me, we have Gutsick Gibbon, and below me is the Dapper Dino. And
Hello.
Today we are covering, like I said, this is the 5th part in this 30-minute segment that we're going to cover. We're actually going to wrap up the video portion of this series today. So we're going to take it from where we start all the way to the end. The thing we're going to talk about today is the concept of out of Africa, the out of Africa model for human origins and dispersal. So just to kind of set the stage for everybody, we started on Erica's channel, then we went to Dapper Dino, then me, back to Dapper Dino, back to me for part 5, and then we're going to finish with just an overall recap, part 6, over at Gutsick Gibbon, so be on the lookout for that when it's available. All the previous parts are linked in the description, as well as links to my guests. And once we finish the series, all the parts will be linked in the description. So if you're watching this, hi, future viewers, all the links should be there so you could watch the full series if you want. If you stumbled upon this randomly, this is part 5, go down below, click the link for part 1. Otherwise, it's going to be really confusing. So like I said.
And if you stop by my channel, there will be a playlist with all 6 of them. So you can just click on it, and then you can just wait like 7 or so hours, and it'll be done.
There you go.
Me too.
There you go, yeah.
Actually.
So today we are talking about, or we're going to talk about the part where they talk about the out of Africa model for human origins and offer a competing model that they say is better. Before we get into anything they say, let's just briefly introduce the out of Africa model. What the heck are we talking about? Luckily, we have our very own paleo expert with us. So, Erica, what's the paleo-anthropological evidence for the out of Africa model?
Careful, that's a big word.
So up until pretty recently, the oldest human remains of anatomical Homo sapiens. So these are critters that are closer to anatomically modern Homo sapiens in cranial and postcranial morphology than they are to things like Homo erectus or the so-called Homo heidelbergensis or cousins like Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so, this is some characteristic traits: more heavy-set brow ridge, more prognathic, and a more reduced chin. And the oldest guys that we had for a while were from 160 to about 230-ish thousand years ago in about Western Ethiopia, which you will notice is, of course, in Africa. Now, the fun thing about this is that young Earth creationists will say, well, that's kind of close to the Middle East, right? And then we found older hominin remains in Morocco that are about 315,000 years. And for those of you who maybe aren't keen on your geography, that is West Africa. So, naturally, we're at a little bit of a snafu here if you're a young Earth creationist, because humans are very squarely seated in the African continent, northwestern to be precise, pretty much as far as you can get without going south from the Middle East. And these guys are, in fact, very archaic, which is interesting and kind of important as a prediction of evolutionary theory, because the oldest humans that we find should look more basal compared to the more recent ones. And indeed, the fossil specimens, that we find in Morocco are more basal than the ones that we find in the Homo in Western Ethiopia, which are more basal than the stuff that we find moving up out of Africa eventually into what is starting to look like more anatomically modern Homo sapiens around 30 to 70,000 years ago. So that's my piece.
So according to the fossil evidence that we have, we started in Africa and radiated from there. That's the takeaway from that.
Yeah, unequivocally so,
Yeah.
right? Like there is just every
way.
single hominid, in fact, starts in Africa. You don't see, except like your very later terminal ends, like Neanderthals and Denisovans,
Right.
which are popping up in Asia and Eurasia, Western Asia, respectively.
Right. So that's the like fossil evidence. The genetic evidence tells you the exact same thing, that we started in Africa, isn't it weird how they kind of go together like that? So we have 4 specific lines of genetic evidence that point to an African origin for humanity. First is just look at raw genetic diversity. You have more diversity within populations in Africa than the rest of the world combined, which just tells you that we started in Africa and radiated through a series of founder events, losing genetic diversity as we went. Just points right back to Africa. And I should note, for the genetic evidence, it specifically points to a most recent common ancestor in sub-Saharan Africa. It points you back to somewhere in like East Central Africa, approximately.
Like Ethiopia, Eritrea sort of area?
Ethiopia region. Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood, yeah. And again, that's for the genetic evidence, which, rather than the fossil evidence, the genetic evidence, you're looking for, convergence points, most recent common ancestry that we've talked about in previous installments. And that points you back in the, 1 to 2 to 300,000 year range to sub-Saharan Africa. So you get more diversity. You also have higher degrees of heterozygosity, meaning for a given gene, do you have 2 of the same allele? Or do you have 2 different alleles for that gene in your genome? Well, you have more heterozygosity within Africa than outside of it. And then one more thing along those lines is you have greater linkage equilibrium within Africa compared to outside. What that means is, picture like a deck of cards, an unshuffled deck of cards, new deck order. If you've got a 7 of spades, right? That's going to be close to an 8 of spades and a 9 of spades. And in a new deck, there's a correlation between one thing and then the cards that are near it. But if you shuffle that deck completely, just throw the cards around, mishmash, whatever, there should, if you shuffle it enough, be no correlation between any one card and whatever the adjacent card is. They should be uncorrelated with each other. That deck of cards is at equilibrium, right? So there's no correlation. You can look at human alleles that way. This specific allele is correlated with this specific allele in some lineages, but in other lineages, there's no correlation between the two. When there's no correlation, that's called linkage equilibrium. African populations have greater linkage equilibrium, indicating that they've been a stable population for a longer period of time with lots of intermixing among those different groups. Whereas outside of Africa, you've got smaller lineages that have more inbreeding. You're going to have greater disequilibrium. You're going to have specific alleles that are linked with other specific alleles at different sites in the genome, right? So we have disequilibrium. Now, the interesting thing with all 3 of these things is it's not just an inside of Africa versus outside of Africa thing. It's distance dependent. So you can plot these things as there's one study that actually plotted linkage disequilibrium as a product of distance from Ethiopia. And it's just a linear pattern. The closer you are to Ethiopia, the greater the equilibrium. The further away you are, the more disequilibrium you find. It's not just an on-off. It's actually a distant dependent pattern. And it all just points straight back to East Central Sub-Saharan Africa. And then the fourth thing, and really what I think is the nail in the coffin for any non-African origin hypothesis, is that when you do a phylogeny of human genomes, everything nests within an African clade. There's nothing outside of Africa that's its own clade. It's all just within that one African clade. And then you've got little subgroups representing migrations outside of Africa, but it all nests within the broader African clade, which is another way of saying that all of the genetic diversity we see everywhere in the world outside of Africa just represents a subset of what is within Africa. That pattern, there's no way to get that if you originate anywhere else in the world. There's no way to get that pattern. So all this genetic evidence, just like the fossil evidence, unequivocally 100% points to an African origin for humanity, Homo sapiens.
Yeah, you don't get that kind of corroboration, right? In very many fields, where you can actually take something, and we talked about this last time, and we'll get there, but they characterize out of Africa as this new idea, and we jokingly mentioned last time that this was in Darwin's Descent of Man, right? This idea of humans coming from Africa. This has been accepted, broadly speaking, accepted as the majority for 40, 50 years, but proposed since Darwin. And it sure is a hell of a coincidence that you've got the fossil record, which is tangible in the present, and the the world of genetics, which is tangible in the present, and then specifically for subsets within genetics. And all 5 of these different things corroborate on this one idea. They converge on this one idea of humans coming out of Africa, emerging as a species within sub-Saharan Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa.
And I think it's interesting because when Darwin was writing this, we didn't really have a whole lot of, hominin fossils and anything, but he was noticing that, hey, a lot of the most sort of like human-like ape fossils that we have seem to be in Africa, and humans are obviously part of this taxonomic group. And if my theory is correct, that a taxonomic group tends to represent an actual lineage, then that's where we should probably look for human ancestors. And so,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so even before we had the excellent, I would say, conclusive evidence that we have now, there's always been, well, not always, but since Darwin and before, there's been reason to think that if evolution is true, Africa is where humans came from. And lo and behold.
Yeah, I want to note on something here too, right? Like, it's not like we haven't been looking outside of Africa. There is a very robust racist undertone that existed before we started, looking for fossils and origins of humans in Africa by, a lot of people who thought it wasn't Africa where humans originated. And people were really, really motivated to find the origin of humanity outside of Africa.
Often in their own specific country. The Germans wanted to find it in Germany. The British wanted to find it in the British Isles.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so it wasn't until, it's funny because, we find like the likes of Java Man, or Dubois called it Pithecanthropus at the time. And, we had Sinanthropus, which also turned out to be Homo erectus, all in, Southeast Asia. And then a couple of guys were just like, I'm going to head down to South Africa to see what we find. And it's the most archaic hominin so far. It's the Tong child. And then everyone went, oh, shit, it's Africa. It's always been Africa. And I'm sure Darwin was just, gyrating in his grave, right? Like he's just,
I told you guys.
I told you so. And then, wow, what an incredible setup, right? Because paleoanthropologists really lay it out. They say it's going to be Africa that we find the origins of humanity. This was a prediction that was set out by the first guys who were thinking about it. They go out, they search everywhere they can. And of course, a lot of these places still have working fossil sites, right? And so outside of Africa and within Africa. And then, lo and behold, genetics comes about, and people start saying, I wonder if we can test this idea that these paleoanthropologists are proposing. And then they do it, and it recapitulates in every possible way you can test it. That is emblematic of precisely how not only good science is done, but how a hypothesis is robustly supported.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So before we actually hit play, and I promise we are going to hit play in just a second here. But before we hit play, I just want to point out for the audience, we just went through just very quick overview of the various lines of evidence that support an African origin for Homo sapiens. I want you to just keep those things in mind as we go through this video and see if anything anybody says in these last 6 minutes or so of this does anything to change or address or challenge or refute anything that we just said. Spoiler, it won't. So let's do it.
The findings from modern genetics have compelled evolutionary scientists to develop a revised story of human origins that shares many striking similarities with the biblical account of the Tower of Babel dispersion. The new model is called the Out of Africa theory and has been popular for many years. This theory proposes there was a near
it has been
extinction
popular
event.
for many years. That's
It's true.
Just
100.
like 120 something, 140.
Yeah,
You know,
give or take.
Causing a population bottleneck that reduced humanity to a single breeding population of just a few thousand survivors.
Yeah, so the Toba super eruption thing, one, was never the consensus. Two, it's fallen severely out of favor because there is absolutely no support that the Toba eruption impacted paleo environments to the degree, and I mean, not even plants, which is the crazy part. They're looking at C3 and C4 plants, and they're not even seeming to be that bothered by the super eruption or regular eruption, whatever. But moreover, right, like recent work has, on this genetic bottleneck and what that's going to look like is significantly larger than 3,000 to 10,000 individuals.
So on
tens of
Toba,
thousands.
so for people who are unfamiliar with this, there's this hypothesis that this large volcanic eruption, Toba, I guess this was about 70-ish thousand years ago, give or take. Very large, like well-documented, absolutely enormous eruption, larger than anything like humanity has experienced, larger than Krakatoa, Tambora, like any of the major eruptions like in recent recorded history. This is orders of magnitude larger than that. It's hypothesized that this would have caused a bunch of extinctions and bottlenecks among large animal species. The problem is you don't actually see evidence for that in plants at the same time, which is where you would expect to see it, including in plants on nearby islands. And that's the kicker, because for like Krakatoa, we can actually find that for nearby islands where you do see that level of disruption. And that was in the 1880s was Krakatoa, I think. Big eruption. This eruption, several orders of magnitude larger, would have left the same evidence for it, and we don't see that in just the immediate vicinity, the disruption in plant life. So there's no, at this point, I remember when I was in grad school, and we talked about a paper on this, and that was 10 years ago. The consensus was like, maybe, but probably not. And that was, 10 years ago, and it has since fallen further out of favor since then.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but the proposal of the bottleneck came from the genetics, right? Like we saw that human diversity was relatively low, and we were effectively like, okay, based off of what we know about how things converge in the past, there's probably some kind of bottleneck going on around this time period. And then people were like, oh, wow, what a strange coincidence. Around that time period, we have this big eruption. Maybe the eruption caused it.
But the other side of that is it doesn't have to be a bottleneck. It could just be a persistent population size in the mid 5 figures. And then this was 60, 80,000 years ago. What else in human history happened 60? Oh, we started dispersing throughout the whole world, so the population got bigger. Mm-hmm. Like maybe this is, that inflection point where the population really starts to get larger as we disperse out of Africa.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so
also we have one of the things. Sorry.
Also, I was just going to say, get the DNA from Homo erectus if that's something that ever happens, or the suite of hominins that potentially make up Homo erectus. All of these different guys. And I suspect you will see something similar as they left Africa. Well,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And also, we're once again getting the creationist confusion of 10,000 with tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Where they're like, oh, yeah, it was 10,000. Like, guys, there's an S on the end of the word tens for a reason.
They're doing the very common thing of quoting the lowest estimate here, rather than the range that you find in the literature.
They take the lowest estimate of the lowest range, right? The Toba range is notorious for, like, this 3 to 10,000. That's notorious for being quite small compared to the estimates given by a lot of other work on this. So,
right.
Though I can't blame them too much because they're usually 4 to 5 orders of magnitude off. So you know what, guys? I can't really complain that you just cherry pick the best part of the range for you because it's still usually so far off that it's
close. It's comparatively closer than normal.
They're going to, in just a minute or two here, they're going to do another trick with these numbers that makes it even worse by conflating. Well, we'll get there. You'll see. They're gonna do some other shenanigans with these numbers to make it worse than it is, because there's more to these numbers than they're actually presenting. Let's continue.
In the out of Africa theory, which is now on the rocks, but in the out.
No,
what?
It's not.
Not at all.
In the out of Africa theory, which is now on the rocks, Dr. Rob Carter, no, it's not. We're just moving on. Just no.
Out of Africa theory, they postulated there was a human population of about 10,000 people for an indeterminate amount of time. They never really say how long it is, but let's say 10,000, 100,000 years. If we compare a modern species that has about that many individuals, you can look at the African cheetah. There's about 10,000 of them in the wild, give or take a few thousand. And they're having massive problems. Birth defects are increasing, reproductive incompatibility in couples is increasing, litter size is decreasing. all the population biologists are essentially assuming cheetahs are going to go extinct. How did Homo sapiens evolve? We supposedly went from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Homo erectus is smashing rocks together, and Homo sapiens that can fly to the moon during a population bottleneck that should have driven us to extinction.
Have at it.
Okay.
There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to unpack there.
Cheetahs have a population size around that size, but they have an effective population size
Bingo.
that is much, much smaller. The estimates for the mid tens of thousands is effective population size.
Exactly. That's
So let's
yes.
let's talk about that a little bit. Effective population size is a measure of genetic diversity. It's basically what's the minimum number of individuals that could give you the observed genetic diversity in a population. And that number is almost always going to be smaller than the actual population until you get to like the white rhino, right? Where it's like, well, there's only one of them anyway. So you can have a population of, 800 million and an effective population size of 10,000 if you start with an extremely small founder population.
Yep.
So cheetahs are in this problem, not because they have an effective population size of 10,000, because I don't remember, but
total.
their effective population size is such that basically they don't reject organ grafts from each other, no matter how distantly related. The average
That's
cheetah
bad.
is about as closely related to any other cheetah in terms of genetics as human full siblings.
Yep.
I didn't know it was that bad. That's really bad. And
It's extremely bad.
and Dapper, I'm so happy that you caught that exact thing. It just warms my heart. When we should start calling you a geneticist, actually.
Well, by the standards of Dismantled, I am a geneticist.
This is true. And a mathematician at that.
Yeah.
And a paleo expert. Why not?
Yeah, so another way, just a tiny little bit of background on this, another way you often hear effective population described is breeding population. And just think about this for a second. If you have a total population of humans of, say, 10,000, think about the age distribution for your average human populations. Most of those are going to be not reproducing at any given time, right? So your effective population size out of those 10,000 humans is going to be way smaller than 10,000. And what they're doing here is they're conflating, as Dapper said, a total cheetah population in the tens of thousands with they actually said earlier, a breeding population in the tens of thousands for Homo sapiens. Those are not the same thing. You can't make that comparison. That is not okay.
A side note to your point there, Dan, is that it's even worse with humans as far as that age distribution goes because we do menopause. And menopause changes the entire thing because we have an entire older group of humans that aren't reproducing but are living and socializing and adding to the total population size. So you can skew it even further.
Yeah.
I want to point out that the creationists are like, oh no, there was a sustained population of a few tens of thousands in the human past. Dude, you have a population bottleneck with an effective population size of 5 at the Ark. Because guess what? After you get to the Suns, Noah and his wife aren't contributing any more genetic diversity. They're done. Yeah. So it's 3 full siblings and then possibly 3 completely unrelated females who are their wives.
Just give it to them. The Ark encounter just completely assumes that they are the most 3 distant females that could possibly exist, right? In order to maximize
those brothers went traveling pretty far and wide to find their wives, apparently.
Haven't you?
Oh, yeah. Let's just continue. Honestly, there's a lot to unpack.
There's so much. Let's just...
But that's just so dishonest with the cheetahs, though. I hate it.
Comparing absolute and effective population size, that's not allowed. And yeah, you can't do that.
This theoretical near-extinction event has been used to explain why all humans are nearly identical genetically. The out-of-Africa theory claims all living humans originated from this small population who lived in the general vicinity of northeast Africa.
Nope.
No. Sub-Saharan Eastern Africa.
For just so for geography, so we talked about fossils before and how the earliest Homo sapiens fossils that we know of right now are from Morocco. That's over here. And then the genetic epicenter is in the Ethiopia neighborhood. That's down here. This over here,
Way off.
That's Egypt. That's not sub-Saharan Africa. That is a different thing.
So, side note too, just because the current fossils that we appreciate as archaic Homo sapiens are found in Morocco, does not eliminate the fact that every other earlier hominin that is going to be on that lineage leading to Homo sapiens is in sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to be Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, this whole big chunk in the East African Rift. And we know that because we have a shit ton of fossils from there of critters that are starting to look like that Morocco Homo sapiens, but aren't quite there yet, right? And curiously, to my knowledge, we don't have any in Egypt, which is quite strange, don't you think?
Yeah, that is odd, huh?
You're going to be so mad in a minute.
I'm already kind of mad about the cheetah thing. I'm not over it yet.
I'm not either, but just you're going to get madder in a minute.
Oh, great.
Alternative studies suggest the small founding population was a little further north, in the general vicinity of the Middle East.
Cite one legitimate study. Cite
I'm going to go back to that just for a second. Sorry, hang on. I just want to...
Small founding population...
Yeah, no.
On the basis of what? That is insane. For the record, like the earliest really that starts to leave Africa, if you really want to get into it, is going to be these Homo erectus looking things. And it looks like they kind of start, we call them Homo erectus. Some people say they're Homo georgicus because it's Georgian Homo erectus.
Which by the way, that's Asia, Georgia. That's up here.
That's going to be significantly further north. And I kid you not, most creationists do not think Georgian Homo erectus is in the humankind, because this thing is the brain case size on this, guys, I want to make this abundantly clear. The brain case on Georgian Homo erectus dips into the Australopithecine range.
Yeah, that's not, no.
So it's not, we're not talking...
Fully ape, as a creationist might say.
Yeah, we're talking fully ape here, gang. It would be insane, and it's for that exact reason that they often boot them from the humankind. But that of course corroborates this idea that we're getting these early excursions by Homo erectus out of Africa. Homo sapiens sticks around, evolves in Africa, and leaves significantly later, and eventually encounters all these hominins elsewhere.
Erica,
where we don't find any? In that red circle.
Yeah, because this is, so for everyone, this is like Mesopotamia. This is Tigris, Euphrates River, modern day Iraq. Like that's what we're looking at.
The dot
right
is basically on where Babylon was.
Not a coincidence.
Yeah, of course
not a coincidence.
What a Weasley thing to do. I actually can't believe this. And the thing is I'm ready. I hope I'm surprised here, but I very much doubt that we're going to get support for the fact that this is the location that is supported by either the genetics or the fossil record. And if they do bring up the fossil record, I'd love to have a conversation about that.
Spoiler, we're not going to get any of that evidence.
Of course not.
Okay, yeah, that would be... Where is this coming from? So, citation needed, guys. Like, you can't just say stuff.
That yes, they can.
We've been through this. This is the third time we've been through this. Yes, they can. They just did, and they will continue to do so.
It's straight up just lying, though. At this point, like unless they provide a source for this, it's just lying.
This right here, this is lying. This is there is like even I, noted non-Paleo expert. I know the locations roughly of the vaguely Middle Eastern, human-like fossils, right? There's the famous one from what is now Israel, right? There's a lot that are around, right? There's, like you said, Georgia, there's Israel, I think there's one in Turkey, there's a few actually in, like, there's some like apes in Greece, but they're not in modern day Iraq. That's where they're not there. And even I know that.
Also, I want to point out...
Oh, go ahead, Dapper. Go ahead.
We've previously gotten papers that they just lied about.
Yes.
I don't think they could find a paper that they could even cherry pick to indicate this. Because remember, watch previous episodes. They took the first sentence of an abstract and was like, look, this paper says we're right. Even though the first sentence of the abstract is the part where you're like, oh, hey, here's a question that I'm going to answer in this paper. So they were willing to lie about papers, but with this one, I don't think we're going to get a citation. So they couldn't even find something to cherry pick to indicate that this is accurate.
Yep.
So to what Dan said a minute ago, right? Like, we do find hominins up in this, and you can't see my cursor, but up in that area up by Turkey, right?
Yeah, up in here.
Yeah, notice there's a big green corridor that extends around the coast there that's perfectly traversable by a lot of different critters. Also, those apes, those are from the Miocene. That's 13 million years ago. Yep. So not quite the time frame that you need. The fossils from Israel are on the other end of that spectrum. They're far more recent, right? And as in approaching, like 150,000 years, something like that.
Yeah, even earlier than that, so like 80 to 100,000, like an earlier, like out of Africa, but then stopped and turned back kind of thing. Like,
the stuff from Crete. Right, early excursions that comes out and then bails, and then Neanderthals occupy the area after the humans were there, which is funny because it means they came out and bailed and left.
Yeah,
so it's cool stuff, sharing these sort of homesteads. But the fact of the matter is, it's really quite funny because a lot of folks use these green corridors to kind of track where you might be capable of finding fossils, because obviously with the pulses of the environment, these green corridors, they come back and they fade, but they tend to be the same general corridors. So you're really going to find a lot of shit along that coastline. And where you're not going to find anything is walking through the middle of the desert. Because if there's one thing apes aren't good at doing, it's walking through the desert. There's a reason why we couldn't do it until we had water skins to carry with us. And that's a lot of desert to cross to get to that Fertile Crescent.
Was a little further north, in the general vicinity of the Middle East. The survivors of this theoretical near-extinction event suddenly grew very rapidly,
no citation.
splitting into numerous smaller tribes, which dispersed outward and gradually filled Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas.
Wait a second.
Stop being lazy with your graphic and actually have it emanate from Africa. What the heck, guys?
This is clearly one of those we stole it from a different documentary style pieces.
Yeah.
Come on. There's another problem here, and it's something that's going to persist throughout the next few minutes, which is treating the out of Africa migration as a single event rather than a long ongoing process where they're like, they were in one place and then they're everywhere. It's like, well,
look, people move directly from Ethiopia right to South America.
Right. It's they treat it like, we'll get there, but this sets up the way they're going to frame this, because what they're going to do is they're going to say, look, what we know from genetics is actually, it's in line with what the Bible says. And this graphic is a really good example of that, basically saying, okay, basically right away you have a rapid divergence everywhere. And that's not how it worked.
Here's something that I'm wondering. Why not just set the Tower of Babel story in Ethiopia? I mean, it's not like it's super specific about its geography. Why not just say the tower was in Ethiopia?
I think the problem is, since they've really hitched their wagon to biblical literalism, it would make them look kind of dumb to be like, yeah, I know we said that the ark landed on Mount Ararat, and that a city was built like in that general area, but actually that general area is just in Ethiopia. It's just,
I guess I still feel like it would be a better tactical move, though.
Right.
Hear me out. In the interest of doing creationism better than creationists, hear me out. The Ark didn't land in Turkey.
Okay.
The Ark landed on Kilimanjaro.
And it was they just called it Ararat.
Yeah,
and
just whatever.
When people moved to like the Turkey region, they were like, "Hey, this reminds me of old Mount Ararat back in Africa. We'll just call it that."
Just look, creationists. Look, that one's free. Next one you got to pay for. But that, if you say Ark, Kilimanjaro, that solves a lot of your problems. That solves really does. A lot of your problems.
It does actually solve quite a bit. Now, it's really not going to be very helpful for the trillions of stone tools that we find across the African continent, but maybe they're making them so fast. They're just zooming.
Remember, according to some young Earth creationists, the way hunter-gatherers work is that they find in situ unworked rocks at their hunting site, nap them real quick right there, use them to kill and butcher an animal, and then just leave them.
Leave them.
Because it's easier to re-nap tools than it is to carry a stone dagger from one hunt site to another.
Keep in mind, chimpanzees have favorite tools that they reuse, the same one over and over again. They're literally saying hunter-gatherers are dumber than chimps. So great job, guys! Yeah. Really awesome.
All right, so
each initial tribe gave rise to its own language and culture, and continued to split and disperse to form the people groups and languages we see today. Each migrating tribe.
So one thing is that they're right now supporting the proto-world hypothesis in linguistics, which says that there is an ancestor language there was an ancestor language that was the ancestor of all extant human languages. That hypothesis is not well supported, but there's also no disconfirming evidence. So it's not actually clear if that's the case, that we can actually trace all languages back to one. There is some evidence for it, but it's not clear if that couldn't be, covered by other hypotheses that involve independent origin of languages. Exactly when, humans start speaking in identifiably linguistic ways is hard to say, because it's a gradient on the one hand. And so I just want to say it's a minor point, but it is not a consensus in linguistics that you can trace all extant human languages back to, or even all known human languages, back to a single common ancestor. That's still unclear.
Thank you for that. I appreciate having a linguistics enthusiast for things like that, so thank you.
Hey, by Young Earth creationist standards, I'm a straight-up linguist.
Let's call you a linguist. Yeah, you're a geneticist and a linguist after today.
And a mathematician.
And a mathematician and a paleo expert.
And a paleo expert.
I wear many top hats.
I would have carried with it a different sampling of the original population's gene pool, rapidly producing the distinctive features that some used to define race.
So that description of how you get ancestral population diversity, that is narrating that star-like pattern, the spokes on a wheel pattern that I described earlier in that silly radiating out of Africa figure, right? They're saying you have an ancestral population and it zoom, 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 zoom. All these groups just fly away from it at warp speed to all the continents. And that's not how it works. It's a series of events where a group leaves and then that group splits and then each of those groups split. It's iterative, right? It's not just one explosion. And
also, there was the implication that they're carrying these quote-unquote racial traits with them. But the fact is that we know that things like pale skin have independently evolved in multiple locations multiple times. And part of the reason we know that is because the genetic mechanism behind the relative lack of melanin is not the same in every population with pale skin.
Yep.
So and just the idea that so it just so happened that pale people just zipped straight from the Middle East to Ireland. That's just a thing that happened.
Yeah.
Why? How?
So
how did they know to go there?
Yes. So something that's always kind of bugged me that I feel like I've never gotten a clear answer from creationists on it. It seems like a pretty simple answer. And maybe one of you guys knows. But is the way that they cope with general history, humans just stayed in the Middle East before Noah's flood, and then Noah's flood happens, and then when they land, then they spread out? Or are we talking about a situation where there were different cultures prior to the flood in different locations across the entire world, and then those cultures either went extinct or the ones that showed back up just picked up where they left off?
So creationism is super vague about what human history is like before the flood and where people were. And one of the things that they don't do is tend to say where Noah took off from, basically. Where was the ark built? And you got to remember, in some cases, creationists are saying that Rodinia is the pre-flood world. So
oh my God, I forgot about that.
Even identifying the location doesn't make a whole lot of sense anyway. Because if you're starting with Rodinia, having Pangea form under the floodwaters and then break up into modern continents,
in case anyone was watching, is not familiar with, everyone's heard Pangea. If you're not familiar with Rodinia, that's an earlier supercontinent. So there are some creationists, I'll call them models. There's some creation models of plate tectonics.
So generous.
It's very generous, but we're being generous. That involve all of the continental movements and supercontinents forming and breaking and mountain ranges forming and all that fun stuff happening during and immediately after the flood.
Underwater.
Underwater.
And then also, once the water recedes, it's still happening.
Yeah. So we're talking
like
continents
Himalayas,
going at race car speed.
like Himalayas growing as like you could picture like an automobile accident, except it's Asia and the Indian subcontinent crashing into each other and creating the Himalayas as the floodwaters are receding, kind of thing.
I'll point out the kind of energy levels involved in this are finite and calculable, and whenever anyone calculates them, one of the easiest ways to express the amount of energy that's released by this is in how many hundreds of nuclear bombs are going off per square meter of Earth's surface per second.
The total that Walt Brown gives for hydroplate, now granted, hydroplate is definitely more extreme than the other versions. The AIG version, and I really want to make this abundantly clear for anybody who might be watching, these are the numbers that they calculated.
Right.
Not us, as in the secular or conventional scientific community. Young Earth creationists proposed these numbers, and they went, "Ooh, what are we going to do? This is really bad." Because the AIG numbers are like, yeah, it's going to vaporize the granitic crust of the Earth about a dozen times over. And the Walt-Brown hydroplate model is the equivalent to 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H bombs.
5,000 trillion?
That's 5,000 trillion. That's his number. That's his number that he provides. And when people were like, it's such a Chad thing, because people were like, oh my God, Walt, that's too much energy. And he's like, sounds like someone else's problem to me. He just doesn't care.
Don't hate
I'll
the
also
player,
point
hate the
out
game.
that's insane.
I don't want to go down all of the the flood model, geological model rabbit hole, but I just want to encourage our viewers, anyone watching, if you're unfamiliar with the truly bananas rabbit hole that is creationist plate tectonics, I encourage you to go down that rabbit hole as far as you want to go. It is bonkers.
It leads you to places where chemistry stops, never mind biology.
We're talking about, to take it back to where we're at, right? You know, Rodinia is separating, and as the floodwaters are receding, right, the continents are still going, as Dapper and Dan both mentioned, at race car speeds, which means continents create a wake. There's a wake around the edge of the continent. They're going so fast. It's insane. Documentaries like Dismantled, you know, it's all fine and dandy when they're just ignoring or making up data. But then, you know, eventually they're going to have to cop to the data that they produced.
Right?
And I don't know what's going to happen when they finally do.
They don't have to
do that. They're never going to have to do that. They don't have to do that.
No, they will. Listen, my prediction, eventually, it may be in 50 years, it may be in 100 years. Eventually, they're just going to go, screw it. It's a miracle. Like, that shit was just miraculous.
Yeah.
Just do that in the first place. Just like
I don't know why they don't
the
just
flood.
do it.
The flood. How did the flood happen?
They know it's not. They know it's not compelling. That's
Problem
why.
solved.
That's the thing. They know it's not compelling.
The flood, blanket statement, miracle, the end. Like, you could just do that. But here's the thing, as a creationist, you can then argue whatever miracle situation you want to impose on the world, you can then argue the physical evidence as it exists now supports that event happening. You can make that case. You already do that. You're just trying to come up with a natural mechanism for the flood. But like you already say, like the Grand Canyon shows how there was a flood. Like, you can do that anyway. Save yourself the trouble. Why are we bothering?
I like to call it the CinemaSins effect, right? Where it's like, Young Earth creationism is like a bad movie that thinks it's a good movie. And so CinemaSins is just like, ding, 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 plot hole, here's a problem, here's another problem.
Yeah.
But you notice the CinemaSins, and actually I haven't watched CinemaSins in forever, but I would imagine that they rarely go after like, you know, Sharknado or like Two-Headed Shark Attack or like Dragon Wars, because why would
We're
they?
forgetting Sharktopus. Sharktopus.
They don't ding the movies that know they're bad. Instead, they're like, you get a pass. And that's what the scientific community would say if Young Earth creationism was like, yeah, it's a miracle. We would go,
okay,
screw it. Like,
fair
what
enough.
am I going to say to that? Sure, whatever. Like, I don't care. It's only when you come in here saying, this is supported by every branch of science except what we have to say, that the scientific community posts up. At least those of us who aren't.
That's a really good, and that's a really good segue into our next thing, because we're going to see them wanting evidence.
Yay!
So, yeah.
In this model, mutations would occur, but are not necessary to explain these distinctive features, which means deep time would not be required either.
Okay, deep time not required. Like, One,
oh my goodness.
It is, because we talked about that last time. What he's talking about, what the narrator's talking about here is created heterozygosity. See part 4. We covered that.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work. But again, same what we were just talking about. Just say, miracle, done, move on. And like, save yourself the trouble. Because created heterozygosity itself is a miracle. So just, if you're going to invoke a miracle, pick one that solves the problem.
Just using standard population genetics principles, we can explain the origin of races easily in hundreds or thousands of years. All we need is the population to fragment into smaller populations. Isolation by distance is going to cause changes over time independently in each population, either through natural selection or just random drift.
Who's got thoughts? Because I got thoughts.
So
Erica, it looks like you have some thoughts.
Listen, as much as I would love to hammer in on this one's all you, Dan.
I do have a few thoughts, which is, like, we know about how quickly mutations can accumulate in populations.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get current human population genetics out of a few hundred years. It's not going to work.
Can't do it.
You're going to need tens of thousands of years.
Need more time. This continues to ignore the pattern of human migration throughout the world. It's not just that we just went, right? We had a path, and we followed a path, and that's how you can see the similarities between lineages.
So in addition to this, like for a gaggle of people who are so constantly saying, you weren't there, you can't actually support, any time period as having been as old as it is unless there were people who lived there, except
this is just historical science.
That still doesn't count, right? It's like, all of these migrations that we're talking about, right, and indeed the places that they settled and eventually set up cities, and the cities eventually, communicated with one another and exchanged cultures and exchanged, bits and pieces of their people and their languages. Like, all of this can be documented and is documented, right? All of these different out of Africa moments, right, and eventually the different societies that pop up around 10,000 years ago, right, and earlier. Like, this is human history. This is documented. There were thousands upon thousands of eyewitnesses, which is something AIG is always asking for and complaining that deep time doesn't have. And yet, even then, even when you have the actual, bona fide, absolutely anal level record keeping of, groups like the Egyptians, or, move over into India, some of these early cities there, some of the first dynasties in China, none of that matters to them. None of it. The histories of each of these individual cultures are effectively erased in order to instill and institute this idea that, reflects the literalist Judeo-Christian interpretation. That's pretty insane.
Yeah. And I'll point out, to support a tradition that we know post-dates many of the historical works that we have from these cultures themselves.
Yep.
The Bible is newer than our oldest records from Egypt and China and Mesopotamia. And presumably other places like the Indus Valley, but we just can't read them, so I guess it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, none of this is to make the Bible less than or degrade it or debase it or anything like that. It's just to say you shouldn't base your genetics off of a very old book. That's all we're saying, right? Like, you just maybe shouldn't do that.
So we have a model for that at the Tower of Babel. A few hundred years after the flood, God separated the nations according to Y chromosome.
I just want to very briefly point out that this is approximately the location of that bullseye we saw earlier in the Middle East that correlated with no evidence for saying it could have originated there. That's about the same spot.
What a shocker. Also, I like that God is just handpicking who's going to get to keep the same language based on Y chromosome. Why?
Yeah, there's no reason for the genetics and the language to have to correlate, but they happen to perfectly.
Very convenient.
It's weird.
Yeah, very convenient.
God separates them by Y chromosome. Gotcha.
Yeah, he's just sitting there with like a genetics test. He's like, okay, you're haplogroup J. I'm going to put you over here in Syria.
Group L? No, back where you came from. You guys are going right back into Africa.
Also,
out of Africa, back in.
It's also curious that one of the things you actually tend to see is there actually is a link between genetics and linguistics. For instance, Y chromosome haplogroup J are almost entirely from ethnicities that are traditionally speaking Afro-Asiatic languages. And they also tend to cluster in areas like North Africa and the Middle East. Why? Why is it that no one from typical, say, Eastern China Y haplogroups speaking a Sino-Tibetan language,
over here.
Why don't any of them just go west? Why? Why not? Why isn't there a Sino-Tibetan language in Tunisia with some people with, a typical Chinese haplogroup?
It's over here.
Why? There's no reason other than just they just kind of did it that way.
I think being generous, I think what they're saying is that you had all of the diversity present. You had founder events where it's not just that they assorted by genotype, but also then within each lineage, they lost diversity in a specific pattern. You're removing pieces from a puzzle, right? So that the pieces that you remove from the North African lineage, you leave in the Eastern Asian lineage, but
you still end up with things like, okay, so the people who are speaking like Indo-European languages, sure, they spread in a couple directions, right? But people speaking Afro-Asiatic languages, they all stick around in the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah,
all of them. The farthest south any of them get is Ethiopia. Why?
That's down here.
Why don't any of them go farther out? And none of the people speaking Sino-Tibetan languages, like Tibetan and Chinese and a whole bunch of other ones, none of them bother to stick around. We don't get any of them left in like Iran.
They're not over here.
That just gets taken over by Indo-European speakers for reasons.
All right, let's keep going.
It's the male lineages that define each population, and they spread out on the earth, and they would have remained separate from one another because of language differences for a time. That's all we need.
Okay, hold up. No. Look.
Nope.
The history of the world is not the history of people who don't speak the same first language not having sex with each other.
Yep.
That is not a thing. People work it out. Or,
figure it out.
Let's be honest, history kind of sucks in a lot of ways. Sometimes they don't even bother working it out and they just go for it anyway.
Once you do that, you're going to have regional differences amongst the people. So all of a sudden we have people start looking more Asian, people that start looking more Norwegian, people that start looking more Australian Aboriginal, and people that start looking more African. All we need is isolation in a short amount of time.
Hold on. We have some of the fossils from some of the first people to enter things like Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't look very European. They still look very much like someone you're going to find in sub-Saharan East Africa.
Yeah, Cheddarman. Cheddarman's the perfect example of that. Mm-hmm. I mean, they got the full genome off that thing, and they recapitulated exactly what this guy looked like. And he's just like a normal dude, but he does not look like he's from the UK.
So the thing is, what that means though is that people start out looking like they're people who have been spending generations in places like, sub-Saharan Eastern Africa. For a reason, that's where they evolved. That's where they're adapted to. And they're now moving into new environments that are not currently adapted to. And we have to wait. So they didn't turn into Africans while starting out looking like Middle Easterners. We know that that's not true. Everyone started out looking like someone from Africa because they were.
This is the point in the video where I want to bring this back to what I said at the top, which is as we hear the evidence, such as it is from our creation science friends,
bold assertions.
Ask yourselves if what they're saying is consistent with what we said at the beginning, and if it does anything to change anything that we said at the beginning. So what Carter is proposing right here, what Dr. Rob Carter is proposing right here, is a Middle Eastern center point, a Middle Eastern hub for the spokes on the wheel, right, that then spread to all the continents from this Middle Eastern point. And he's very clear about this, that each lineage is independent and not interbreeding with any of the other lineages for some amount of time as they separate geographically. Remember what we said at the beginning, where you have more genetic diversity within Africa, you have more heterozygosity within Africa, you have more linkage equilibrium within Africa. How does that happen if the spoke of the wheel is outside of Africa?
Well, even if we locate the center of genetic diversity in, say, the Middle East, let's just pretend that's where it was. His model, where all these lineages just independently travel to the four corners of the earth, would then mean that, sure, there might be greater diversity right at the center, and there might be more linkage equilibrium, but it should not have a nice linear relationship with distance from that center.
Bingo.
It shouldn't be a similar color
It should
gradient.
it should at least be stepped. Native North Americans shouldn't have lower genetic diversity and more linkage equilibrium than, say, Central Asians, but they do.
Disequilibrium, I think you mean, but yes.
Oh, did I reverse those?
They should have let, because it's more steps in the chain out. It should it should be greater disequilibrium. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
I did
exactly,
reverse it.
right? According to what they're proposing, where it's like the spokes of a wheel, then that doesn't have to be the case. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a mess. It's a big giant mess, and it's inconsistent with the genetic data.
Evolutionary geneticists reporting in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences have named this specific model the instantaneous divergence model.
Have they?
This model is virtually indistinguishable from the biblical model of the human dispersion associated with the Tower of Babel, as recorded in Genesis chapter 11.
Okay, so I want to point out here that they're now bringing into this a different model, right? We've been talking about out of Africa this whole time. Now they're saying, no, we're not out of Africa with these sequential bottleneck events, right? It's an instantaneous divergence model. And this is hub, spokes, everyone just boom, all at the same time to get wherever in the world, right? I just want to pause here to point out different model.
Yep.
They're now saying the Bible describes this instantaneous divergence model, and which, okay, I can buy that that's what it describes.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
What they're saying is this is what the evidence is consistent with. That's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That is completely wrong. But that's what they're saying. They're saying Bible, instantaneous divergence, genetic evidence also leads to that. The second half of that is wrong. All right, so that's...
Can I say something that's slightly off topic, but it's really quick? I really love this painting. That's it. I love this painting. It's so great. I mean, look, there's this great aerial perspective, and there's so much detail. And you know what? I don't care how historically absurd it is.
It's cool.
I adore everything about this painting, and it's great. And I appreciate that they use it so much because it's a wonderful painting.
So I just want everyone to keep in mind now, we're at a separate, they're saying instantaneous divergence, separate model, consistent with Bible, consistent with genetics. They're wrong about the genetics on that. That's what they're saying. That's what the narrator just said.
Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth.
One of the funny things about the out of Africa theory is that it actually mirrors the biblical account.
No.
We have
No. We just did this. You just said another model mirrors the biblical account, and the genetic evidence points to that model. It's the instantaneous divergence model.
They're hoping that their audience will think that the instantaneous dispersal model is a subset of the out of Africa model, which is not.
Rob Carter just straight up contradicted what they said 30 seconds ago. There are two different models.
They're counting on their audience not knowing that.
I wonder if they didn't just get interviews from a lot of these, geneticists and then have Roop kind of stitch it together. Like they gave all the interviews to Roop before the script was written, and Roop was just like,
well, this doesn't work.
It can't be both. You can't use the instantaneous model and the out of Africa model, which the out of Africa, it's not just about the African origin. It's about the temporal and spatial migration pattern, right? There's components to this model. And what they've set up is out of Africa, blah, 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 inconsistent. This new model, this instantaneous model works better. That's what the Bible describes. Then Rob Carter comes along and is like, out of Africa, like the Bible talks about. It's like, pick one.
Which one
No,
is
they
it,
don't.
guys?
They don't have to. The thing is, they don't have to because their target audience isn't people who disagree with them, who know what they're talking about. Dan, you are not their audience. Erica, you're not their audience. Their audience is someone, and I've said this many times before, their audience is someone who goes to church every Sunday, who has some job in a field that's completely unrelated to this. Maybe they're like an IT guy or an auto mechanic or something,
All of
right?
which is cool. You do you.
There's no obligation to have a job in this field, right? Most people don't, and it's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But what it does mean is you're not the person who's equipped to critique this most of the time. And they just want to keep you donating.
I think that's fair.
I'll tell you this. I wouldn't walk into, an auto body shop or, an IT department and start, tossing my weight around. Like, I'm the one who deserves to speak about this, And yet, here we've got Captain Marine Biologist here telling us all about genetics. Rob Carter, geneticist. I don't know. I guess they really, as Dapper mentioned it earlier, he was joking around, but I guess the guys at AIG just really do wear a lot of different hats. I can't even believe. I mean, I can. I don't know.
You can.
I'm more and more jaded every time.
We have spent, at this point, how many hours watching them? We can believe it.
About 7, ultimately.
It'll be by the end.
Oh, in just this.
I think it's not 7 yet, but it will be.
Oh, okay.
7
Maybe it's
by the
about
end,
6.
Yeah. All right.
It's a lot of hours. But I mean, it's tough when every single sentence, not every single sentence, but
close.
At least 95% of sentences for real in this entire documentary is just either incorrect or it's incorrect in a bold-faced lie. I mean, what do you do with that? And this is being marketed to people and sold to them. That's so insulting.
We have a population of people that originated in Africa sometimes in a distant past. Well, biblically, we started with 2 people. Our population grew to thousands of people. We don't know how many. And then our population crashed biblically at the flood. Well, in the out of Africa theory, we had a lot of people and it crashed during a bottleneck. And then the population began to grow in both models. And then
again, this is similar to last time when near the end I pointed out the accurate but vague trick, right? Let's assume that everything they've said about out of Africa in terms of the Toba bottleneck, and let's just assume all that stuff is true, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got, you have a bottleneck? We have a bottleneck.
Mm-hmm. But no.
Our bottleneck was best case scenario for you, right? Our bottleneck was 3 to 10,000, and yours was 8.
5. I'm not going to let that go.
I'm going I'm saying full population.
All right, fine.
Let's go full population. Let's be generous. Again,
okay.
I like to be generous. I like to be super generous and show how it's still banana pants. Right?
Fair enough.
So let's use effective population size for humans and actual for the evolution model and the actual population size for the biblical model, right? One model, 3 to 10,000. Let's just say 3,000. Sure, why not? 8. Now, I'm pretty sure that 3,000 people 70,000 years ago versus 8 people 4,500 years ago is going to look different in terms of the current level of diversity within that population. And we can do that math, that we can then say, if the population was this size, this many thousand years ago, here's the diversity we expect to see in the present, and then we can sequence DNA and check our numbers.
It has to be before the data, right? You can't. Jensen came out here and made all these predictions when the data was already out, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a prediction. Right now, if Nathaniel Jensen
and he was still wrong.
And he was still wrong. Yeah. Now, if Nathaniel Jensen was born in the 80s, and he was you know what? He was or not born in the 80s, working in the 80s. And he was you know what?
I was going to say,
here are all my predictions that I'm going to lay out. And then it turned out that those predictions were actually right. So this is an alternate universe where YEC is legitimate. And his predictions are actually correct and work with population genetics. And he's using substitution rates and he's doing all the right stuff. Then we would have something to sit around and talk about. But that's not what's happened here. He's creating retrodictions. And he's also doing it with the information that shows that he's wrong already publicly available for anyone to see.
And yet he's still salty that he didn't revolutionize biology.
I mean, is for real though, do you think he's duped himself, or is he kind of he got degrees.
I don't know. It's hard to say because the thing is, I have trouble imagining that he thinks that he's not lying. But on the other hand, he's so visibly salty about the fact that no one takes him seriously that he's got to think that he's right on some level.
I think he's high on his own supply. is what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fair take.
Dr. Jansen, I would love to talk to you about your new book, Traced. You can come on, you can promote your work, and we can talk about it. Let me know.
I don't know.
He's not gonna.
All right. We got a minute left, and there's a couple
All right, we can do
questionable
it.
claims in here, and then we're mercifully done with this 30 minutes and 38 seconds.
I feel like I've been put through the dryer. Like,
Seriously.
Population fragmented and spread across the world in both models. The Bible was written first, and we're stuck with it.
The Bible
There's
was
a
not written before
limited range of
genetics.
possibilities biblically about human history. Back in the day, though, evolutionary theory, they could say whatever they wanted, and the most common view back in the day was the multi-regional hypothesis that human beings just
No,
evolved.
No, that is a lie.
no, it
Just
was
straight
not.
up, that's a
We
lie.
talked about that already. That's just blatantly false. Not only did out of Africa come first, but it was the dominant idea. Like, for the majority, I mean, I say majority just because I'm leaving room for like a time period when literally someone died and they were like, oh, for a brief moment, it was like in favor of multi-regionalism.
Like in the
and it would have had to be during, like, the
1870s
20s.
or something.
Yeah, I was going to say like the 20s even. Like,
Yeah.
have to, you're right. The Conchild was that recent. I mean,
Right.
yeah, this is insane, right? There's a reason it's been out of Africa. All of the support is for out of Africa in as far as public perception goes, because that's where people went to find the fossils, guys. Like, that's where they went because they knew that's where it happened. Oh God, but that's just lying. Like, again, I can't stress that enough. Like, that's just someone who hasn't taken. I mean, we teach that to biological anthropology students, like freshman levels, who are taking it and they're business majors. And they come and they walk out of there knowing out of Africa and knowing the history of the ideas of human dispersal patterns. Like, I just don't understand how someone, even with a marine biology degree, who is making a documentary about debunking human evolution wouldn't have accidentally stumbled across that. And I know we've said that before, but it just really works me up when this has had Dan's, and I'm sure Dapper too, but Dan with the genetic stuff, I'm sure that's how you felt this whole time, but it's like, you're just lying.
Yeah. I have given up being generous to the motivation because it is so obvious that a group of people, Sanford, Carter, Jansen, a group of people that have earned legitimate PhDs from legitimate institutions does not get this stuff. It is inconceivable to me when, just so the audience knows, I teach Intro to Evolution. I teach the freshman level Intro Evolution course, and there are errors in here that I shouldn't say freshman level because they have to, it's the second, it's a 200 level course. Those undergraduates.
Freshman level though. Mine's freshman level.
Those undergraduates, they could watch this and be like, that's not, no, that's wrong. They can pick out the errors.
The thing for me is like, okay, the options are basically you're colossally dumb to a degree that makes it hard for me to believe that you have the capacity to get an undergraduate degree, never mind a PhD.
No, they're not dumb. They're not dumb.
I struggle with that one.
They're not dumb.
So it's either they're that dumb, which seems incomprehensible, or they're just lying.
Yes.
Which is why I tend, at least for professional creationists, like I said, not for that guy who's just going to church every week, who happens to be at a younger creationist church. That guy isn't necessarily lying. I don't think he is, because, I mean, I was that guy once, and I wasn't lying. But these guys, they're lying.
Yeah.
It's just so hard to conceive that they could possibly be this dumb and also have PhDs. They couldn't.
And that sucks, right? Like, that just sucks as a concept. I want to be clear, like, Dan's a professor, I just TA, but like, yeah, the students that come into my labs, right, like it's a freshman level course. They could also watch this and point out its errors. Mm-hmm. I don't know where you go from there.
Let's finish this up. It's all very preachy from here to the end, so let's just let this go, and then we'll get our final thoughts.
In synchrony across the planet and exchange genes as we evolved and evolved and evolved. They did not expect a bottleneck. They did not expect going through the Middle East. They did not expect a Y chromosome atom and a mitochondrial leave. But those are things that have to be true if the Bible's true. And those are things that the modern geneticists have discovered. So what we're seeing over time is that the evolutionary model is getting more biblical, which is really interesting.
Is that it?
That's it.
No one expected that we would find evidence for, us going through the Middle East because we did it. Because we did it, guys. Like, that evidence doesn't exist.
Didn't come from there.
Here was the documentary that was meant to present the evidence for out of the Middle East.
No, remind me.
Didn't present it.
They said that some studies supported the Middle
That
East
was the
idea.
one line. That was the one line.
Which study did they cite? I don't remember.
What? There wasn't even like a little thing at the bottom where it's
No.
like, here's a footnote, and if you purchase the full documentary, you can get access to our bibliography, and then you can go to the
Right.
footnotes and find out how we're lying and misrepresenting the paper. They couldn't even do that because
No,
Dapper
this is
is
nothing.
right. They couldn't even find a paper to butcher, to mangle, to reach that hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's not supported by the genetics, as we've beaten to death on this episode. It's not supported by the fossils, as we've beaten to death on this episode. It's not supported by history. It's not supported by linguistics. There is not a shred of existing data that would allow you to differentiate this hypothesis from what is completely conventional.
Yeah.
That they've presented.
Can I say I'm still not over the cheetah thing?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
I'm going to be angry
Okay.
about the cheetah thing for the rest of the night.
Erica, I don't have anything to add to what you just said. Are you good?
I'm good.
Dapper, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are it's just infuriating how obviously dishonest this is. Because the thing is, like we've all said, we all started doing some actual serious counter-creationism stuff, thinking that for the most part, we're dealing with honest people, because that's what you expect in science. The most important thing that you can do in science is be honest. You don't have to be right. You just have to be honest. Most people are wrong about their new hypotheses that they propose because most possible explanations aren't true. That's just how it works. But no one cares if your hypothesis is wrong. They care. I mean, they do because, they're going to reject it if it is. But in terms of your career and you being a respectable scientist, that's not what's important. What's important is, are you honest with the data? Are you open about your methods and things like this? When you start lying, if you're an actual honest-to-God scientist and you start lying about your data, once people find out about that, that's it. Your career is done.
Unless you're famous.
Well, okay. But
Because
as a rule,
that some people don't have to follow because they're famous. Don't get me started.
Again,
about academia.
that's not the ideal.
But,
that's not the ideal. But generally speaking, unless you're some kind of crazy superstar, once people find out that you're just fudging your numbers and lying in your papers, that you're done.
Yeah.
That's it. The big takeaway I want to hammer home is, though, that in the scientific realm, you expect honesty. You expect that when people cite a paper, it supports the thing that they're citing it for. You expect that when they say that studies show a thing, they bother to cite at least one study that says the thing. But we're at the point now where these creationists would fail a high school paper because they're just lying about their sources.
They're not sourcing it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're not sourcing, and when they do, they're lying about the source.
I really struggle with this, right? Because like citations, that's like one of the cornerstones of science, right? Like if you're going to publish a thing and I kid you not, my thesis had like several citations after almost every sentence.
Yeah. Oh, literally.
That's insane. Like that's how it is.
And that's not actually even unique to science. Like when I was getting my history degree, history uses footnotes. That's just a thing. Many of the pages in my my papers for my more later classes, more than half of the text on any given page was footnotes.
In fairness, this is a documentary. It's not a paper.
Yeah.
But the claims here are refuted in many cases, as we have shown, by the sources they show on screen.
On screen, yeah.
So let me just wrap this up for everybody, because we are getting philosophical here, and that is what we'll do in the next segment. So here's what we've done. If you have somehow watched this entire series, first of all, you need a hobby. Mm-hmm. Second of all, this may be your hobby, and that's fine. I appreciate that. It's my hobby too. That's cool. So this is part 5 in the series. We started with, so we're taking this 30-minute chunk of this dismantled documentary, and we've gone they've made 5 major claims. and we have addressed them in 5 parts. The first part was over on Erica's channel, then we went to Dapper's channel, then we went to my channel, then went back to Dapper's channel, then you're watching this back on Creation Myths, my channel. Now, for part 6, we're going to go back to Gutsick Gibbon, and we're going to wrap this up. We're going to get our final thoughts, our kind of big 30,000-foot view. Let's contextualize this thing, right? What did we just do? We spent 6-ish hours going through 30 minutes of creationist documentary. Let's put a pin in it. Let's put a nice neat bow on it. We're going to have that conversation in part 6. So this has been part 5. We have completed the document. Now we're going to talk about kind of big picture. That'll be in part 6. That will be over with Erica. Thank you, everybody, if you've watched this long. I really appreciate. Go subscribe to Gutsick Gibbon. Go subscribe to Dapper Dino. Links are down below. Thank you. Have a great night.